Hello, I'm Sasha Damani. I'm chair of the Institute of Faculty of Actuaries and Mortality Research Steering Committee. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this latest webinar that's hosted by the Mortality and Longevity Member Interest Group. We've got an excellent topic for you today and some great speakers, specifically concerning one of the IFOA's current activities in the area of mortality improvements. But before we get to that, let me just introduce my fellow speakers. Caroline Roberts is the Longevity Risk Manager at the Phoenix Group, which is, I understand to believe, the largest specialist consolidator of the life insurance and pension funds in Europe. She's got over 10 years experience working in longevity models and assumptions, and in recent years, she has played a major part in the development and management of their longevity models and assumptions. Second, we are joined by Matthew Edwards, who works in the life practice for Willis Towers Watson, where he leads the biometric risk and analytics activity across Europe. He's involved in a number of IFO activities. He's a long-standing member of the Mortality Research Steering Committee, for whom he is the editor of the Longevity Bulletin. He's chair of the CMI, and he leads the COVID-19 Actuaries Response Group. Also joining us is Stephen Baxter, who is Head of Longevity Research and Innovation for Club Vita, as well as also being a member of the MRSC. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to you, the audience, for joining us. Hopefully this will be interesting. I'm going to start by handing over to Matthew, who's going to give an overview of the mortality improvements work stream in general, before we'll pass on to Caroline to talk about a few bits, and then we'll go from there. So Matthew, without further ado, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sasha, and thanks everyone for attending. So my name is Matthew Edwards. I'm here in my capacity as a member of the Mortality Research Steering Committee, the MRSC. So just to note, just to make sure I'm not getting my hats or fingers and pies mixed up, I'm not in any way speaking in a CMI capacity or a COVID-19 ARG capacity. I think Sasha may have flatteringly referred to me as a lead of the ARG, where I'm very much just a co-lead along with Stuart and Nicola, so I don't want to take more than a third or a lower fraction of the glory there. So looking to give you a few slides, a few minutes worth of overview of what we're doing, and then hand over to Caroline, who will talk more about the longevity catalysts, and then to Stephen Baxter, who'll talk more around some of the overall benefits and the whole, if you like, shape of the vision, and then we'll have a bit of Q&A from Sasha, or questions from Sasha, and I get hoping for answers from us. So that's by way of an introduction. So Dan, if you could move on, please. So predicting future population mortality variations, and I've put predicting in quote marks because obviously it's always a dangerous word to use, even for a profession that's supposed to be all around predicting. So clearly, those of us in the UK and many of us outside the UK are very familiar with the CMI projection model and regard it as a very good thing, a very useful tool. But the way it's designed and obviously fitting within the CMI's remit, it's very much not around trying to give the sort of guaranteed long-term future prediction. It's much more a mechanism for taking recent mortality data, so England and Wales population data as the sort of standard default, and extrapolating mortality patterns from that into longer term user supplied assumptions. And that clearly leaves a gap between, if you like, the sort of the first few years of extrapolation and that longer term. So you've got sort of two major types of decision to make in using it. One is that how you're actually doing that blending from the short to the longer term, and of course the long-term rate itself or themselves, because of course they could differ by gender. And all of this decision making has generally been seen as highly subjective and or opaque. So our objective overall really is to try and make it more objective and clearer. And even if some of the clarity might be just from sort of segmenting that subjectivity into a set of different stages, each of which still involves some subjectivity, because we're never going to abolish subjectivity entirely, even that would be useful, I think, what we think from a point of view of improving the clarity of the process, and hence the ability to sort of explain what we're doing, or you as potential users of this mechanism to your stakeholders. So basically, again, therefore, create a sort of methodology which will create some sort of, again, prediction in quote marks of future population mortality, to give us a useful reference point from which to parameterize this CMI model, or just validate your existing parameterization, which is a sort of similar and an equally useful thing, we think. So that's the overall vision, which is, hopefully a good thing from your perspective, and unfortunately not a trivial task. So we've been thinking about it for a good year or more, and working on it for a year or more, and much more to do, as we'll see in the next slide or two. So looks nice and simple here, just 3 boxes. So starting off with creating our own sort of IFOA classification of causes of death. So we wanted to start, we want to involve a cause of death model or mechanism in the overall process, but we wanted to actually have a categorization which was if you like, more in tune with what we think the drivers of longevity are, and hence that's going to be somewhat different from the sort of standard off-the-shelf ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. So there's an initial step around creating our own classification of cause of death, and then think through what are the drivers which are going to make those make the rates, the mortality rates within those cause of death change. So the middle box there, which Caroline will talk about in more detail, and then the third box, the ultimate thing then is to sort of once we've got those first two and come up with some quantifications to quantify life expectancies from that, and see how those convert into sort of equivalent parameterizations of the CMI model. So looks incredibly simple, but obviously a lot more to it than that. So if we can move on, please. So sort of thinking through what we wanted our approach to be, and this sort of takes me back to more than a year ago. I remember some of the meetings and calls happening shortly before we all went into lockdown. We sort of set out a range of different options, and you could see there, I won't go through them one by one, but you can see there the range of different options we've been thinking through, just to make it clear we haven't just decided on one approach that was our own sort of pet favorite in some way. We sort of wanted to explore a range of different approaches, and we've sort of set them out on this particular table in order of increasing complexity from bottom to top. So the bottom may be what many of you have already been doing in your own particular firms or whatever. And we then had a number of criteria, which we'll see on the next slide. Success criteria, and again, I won't go through these one by one, or but just to give you a sense of the sort of things we're thinking about. Something that hopefully makes sense. So clearly, number one, the data model used to create the calibration could be made available to users, or number 4, methodology creators, conceptually simple. I mean, they all we thought made sense, and so we sort of went through the different approaches, and so if I cross-index them with the success criteria to try and work out which of them seem to fit best. And one of the ones which is important here, I think, is number 7 at the bottom, that the option chosen would be capable of being delivered, created, developed in different phases. So rather than being a 0 to 100 sort of project, the idea is for us to be able to be more incremental, which obviously is good for us as volunteers working at it, and hopefully also useful for you as the potential future users. So hopefully that all makes sense. If we can move on to the next slide, we'll see what our sort of, if you like, answer was to the problem. So we basically sort of, from considering the options against the success criteria, ended up with this vision of trying to move to option B as the eventual prize, but starting with something which is more akin to E. So starting off with a model using public domain data, so in particular the ONS data, and we'll sort of talk about that in a bit. Calibrated that based upon a finite set of scenarios. I can't remember why we had the word finite in there, but maybe just to make it clear, we're looking at a sort of a small number of deterministic scenarios as opposed to as a mathematically infinite number of stochastic scenarios, calibrated using expert judgment, and trying to do that with reference to the expert judgment being around the choice of drivers, setting the drivers such as smoking prevalence or whatever, but Caroline's going to talk through that, and the linkage from driver to cause of death. So again, trying to segment the subjectivity then and make those different elements of subjectivity more clear. And then starting off with E, ending up with B, which hopefully is bigger and better and more flexible. So that's hopefully that makes sense as both a good long-term aim and also a sort of sensible working procedure to get there. And hopefully that what I've sort of spoken about over the last 5 minutes makes it more clear, sort of process we've gone to sort of work out that overall approach. Can we move on, please? Thanks. So where are we now? Well, we started on this more than a year ago, as I said earlier. So the following done something funny to my screen. The following are all well underway. We've got a sort of subset of the group working on mapping the ICD codes to what we regard as a sort of a more sensible overall, if you like, or IFOA, sort of cause of death categorization. There's been work underway on an aggregation tool to aggregate those, and also sort of a thinking around how we're going to do this, equate the life expectancies under our methodology with the CMI model, which I think you'll appreciate is not necessarily particularly complex, but it's more a question of having a sort of a clear method as to which things we're going to want to vary more as opposed to less, and a mechanism to make the logistics of doing large numbers of runs, if we need to, more easier for us. And that's all well underway. And then the bottom up is more things which have been, some of them started, others are sort of starting soon. So the first is ONS data work. So we've had lots of calls with the ONS. And as part of that, we're sort of looking to develop sort of a data transformation tool to sort of take the ONS data and turn it into a shape that sort of fits more readily with our work. There's a call for research. So I think Caroline will sort of talk a bit about that, sort of trying to get more people involved. And then tendering, where we want to be looking to get external inputs into some of the elements in the overall process, tendering to external parties done through a sort of a normal IFOA tendering process. So we're at I think what we regard as a reasonably sensible stage. Clearly, we could have been quicker if we hadn't had the odd pandemic getting in the way, but things have been moving ahead. We've got lots of very competent and hardworking people involved. So all credit to them, definitely not to me. And we're hoping to be keeping on going, getting more people involved, and hopefully you'll get a sense from this, and again from Caroline's section, that it's all moving in a sensible direction, and we'll end up with providing something with very useful to users. So that's it from me, I think, and over to Caroline.
Hi, hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you very much, Matthew, and Sasha, for the introduction. So my name is Caroline Roberts, and I have been volunteering with the MRSC to help them really make a start on producing this cause of death model. And the area which I've been helping out in is considering what is a longevity catalyst, documenting some, and thinking about how we're going to be using these going forward. So if we start with my first slide, so the starting point for the cause of death projection model will be the historical data by cause, which will ultimately be sourced from the ONS. So once we have that data, what we then need to be able to do is to project these causes of death and consider how they may change in the future as a result of longevity catalysts. So what are longevity catalysts? So in order to produce a projection of how mortality rates will change in the future for each cause of death, it's important to firstly understand what are the catalysts that have impacted mortality rates in the past before we can go on and produce a model of how the catalysts will have an impact in the future. So some catalysts will have taken place quite a long time in the past and will no longer be actually impacting longevity improvements. So as an extreme example, the introduction of a polio vaccine in the UK was so successful that there have been no deaths from polio caught in the UK now for many years. Therefore, this is no longer contributing to longevity improvements. So we then think about catalysts that have taken place in more recent history, and where we are actually still seeing the impact on longevity improvements. So the obvious example of this was probably the smoking ban, where yes, that took place about 10 years ago, but we are still seeing the impact come through in our longevity impacts, which are likely to be driven from that smoking ban. We then have emerging catalysts. So these are catalysts that we might just be seeing the impact starting to emerge. So even though the catalyst has taken place, it hasn't quite fed into longevity improvements. So for example, stem cell therapy, we're starting to see being used potentially for diseases of the nervous system, such as Parkinson's disease. And then finally, we have the catalysts that are maybe a little bit more science fiction at the moment, but good progress is being made. So, for example, a catalyst may emerge over the next few years and then start feeding into longevity improvements in, say, 10 to 20 years' time. Now, for a life insurance company, it seems a lot, trying to predict something that far in the future seems a little bit nonsensical, but for a life insurance company or a pension scheme with deferred members, then we are looking to project life expectancy for at least 30 to 40 years, if not more. So at least as difficult as it is, we want to try and think about what might be the next big thing. So nanotechnology, I think, is something which potentially we might start seeing come through in treatments in the future. All these catalysts that I've mentioned have all been positive and would increase life expectancy, but we are also interested in any catalysts because they can be negative too. So, for example, increasing antibiotic resistance. So we can move on to the next slide. Now, as a starting point for the process of identifying the universe of catalysts, we've determined 5 potential drivers. And these are drivers that Matthew was talking about as will be kind of like being used to create the scenarios for the cause of death model. We've determined 5 different potential drivers or themes of catalysts. And these groups are set out here. So first of all, we've got politics and economics. So these are very much government-led initiatives, e.g., for example, laws and taxes on cigarettes, where as a result of government policy, we see things feed through to the health of the nation and hence longevity improvements. We've then got climate and environment. Now, this could be either the impact of climate change itself, we potentially will be seeing an increase in deaths in the future as a result of hotter summers, but it also could be the drivers that are taking place to address climate change. So, for example, net zero carbon emissions by 2050 could have a positive impact on respiratory diseases. Medical interventions, that's possibly the fairly obvious one, really. Here we are looking at treatments that may emerge, emerging and may emerge in the future. We've then got technological advances. So I think something like wearable technology is a really good example of this, and we're seeing perhaps in recent history as people get more and more addicted to their step counts, then maybe that is having a real positive impact on the health of the nation and is something that could lead us to mortality and longevity improvements. Also something like e-consults, something which we're seeing more and more as a result of the pandemic. They could be a good thing because people who potentially struggled to get a doctor's appointment in the past can now a lot more easily accessible, or it could be a bad thing because is there a potential for diseases to be missed if there isn't a face-to-face appointment? And then finally, we've got social trends. So for example, drinking patterns amongst young adults appear to be such that, that younger people are drinking less alcohol. So that might lead to them having healthier lifestyles. So once we've identified a universe of catalysts, we can go on to describe what catalysts are expected to impact which of the disease groups. So here it's worth explaining what the disease groups are that we are putting into that, how we've divided the disease groups into the cause of death model. Certainly this is the current plan at least. So within the cause of death model, we have to group causes of death together for projection purposes because there's many hundreds, if not thousands, of causes of death. Now, there are many ways in which these diseases can be grouped together, and too many groups would introduce too much granularity and would make modelling more difficult. But then too few groups mean that when we actually start applying the catalyst to the disease group, we may be under or overestimating the impact that it has. So the proposed structure of the model is that it's got these 11 driver groups. Some of them are fairly obvious, so like grouping together all the different types of heart disease, stroke, respiratory diseases. Cancer is one where there's actually quite a number of different ways where deaths from cancer could be grouped. And our objective here was to have a small number of groups, but to group cancers in such a way so that each cancer in the group will be impacted by catalysts in a similar way. To explain the first one, so Cancer Research UK has identified 4 cancers of unmet need. These are lung, pancreatic, esophageal cancers, and also brain tumours. Now, these share poor 5-year survival rates and have realised only limited improvements in the past decade. Therefore, these 4 cancers have been grouped together to reflect late diagnosis, poor survival rates, and limited catalysts likely to improve the death rates in the short term. Though having said that, having been identified by Cancer Research UK as a key priority, it might increase the likelihood of improvements in the medium to longer term. Aside from the medical advancements, which are likely to impact cancer across the board, the main risk factors for cancer are smoking and obesity. And therefore, these have been separated into two disease groups. There are some potential overlap where cancer has both smoking and obesity as risk factors. So in this case, we've based the categorization on which is the most material driver. And then the remaining cancers are grouped together as another. And typically, these cancers are highly treatable with a better outcome than many other forms of cancer. So you see, by dividing these groups in this way, hopefully we will be such that the catalysts will affect these the cancers in each of these groups in a similar way. So once we have our universe of longevity catalysts and we have our disease groups, we can start to think about how to combine them. So for each of the driver groups, we want to consider what catalysts we have had and are expected to have the greatest impact. So here's an example of what catalysts may impact coronary heart disease. So for completeness, this table does show the historical catalysts that have impacted improvement rates in mortality in the past. But when it comes to the modelling of this disease group, it isn't likely to form part of the projection process, as it's very much what's happened in the past. So we're more interested in the continuing, emerging and future catalysts. And here we can see what we think might expect future mortality rates from this disease. And we've put them into high, medium and low impacts to assist with the future modelling. So under continuing, we have things like the drugs for treatment of cholesterol and hypertension, like statins. So again, that's something which we've seen a lot of improvements from in the last 10 to 20 years, but we are still continuing to see those improvements and probably will continue in future. And then going further out into the future, use of nanotechnology might be something that, can be used in the treatment of heart disease. So here I've introduced you to just some of the catalysts and how they may impact just one of the disease groups. Now, we have pulled together a full list of catalysts that we have identified within within the volunteer and the research group, and we've also, and how they've impacted the different disease groups. And these are all combined together in a report which we've written called the University of Longevity Catalysts, a call for research, which is on the IFOA website. So I would highly recommend you to read this. So what are our next steps? Well, this is where we need you. We're looking for more volunteers and for research that will help us assess one or more of the longevity catalysts and the potential areas of research. So really, here we are really calling out to actuaries and to people working in medical research and to anybody really. If there is any publicly available research which you think that might help us understand these catalysts further, then please let us know. So just go on to the next slide. And here we've just literally listed the kind of potential research areas that we might be looking for. This isn't necessarily a comprehensive list, but it really is giving people an idea of the areas that we are looking at. So here we start off and again, some of these areas I suspect, and we know there is lots and lots of research out there. And I think the first one on the list there, the changes in smoking incidence and its impact on mortality, there is a lot of research out there. But do we have it all? Maybe not. And then it goes down to areas of research which is really emerging, and those that, for example, the really obvious one here is the changes in future improvements that might be a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the ideal research will provide some or all of those pieces of information. So the kind of areas we are looking at, okay, so for these different kind of areas, so what has been the historical impact of this catalyst? What change in trend has it driven? And what time period over which has that catalyst exhibited the changes? Then what are the future expectations of the catalyst? How is it expected to change the current and future trends? And what disease groups is the catalyst expected to impact? And what is the expected range of impacts on the mortality rates? So while an ideal piece of research will cover all those elements, many pieces of research will only cover some of it. So for example, annual statistics on smoking trends are readily available, which will give the impact of the smoking ban catalyst, but it won't give the information on the impact of disease groups. But then there is other research available that describes the relationship between, say, smoking and heart disease, but doesn't give the information on smoking trends. But then we can combine those two sets and therefore aim to identify, so really we want to identify as much relevant research as possible, even if it doesn't cover all these pieces of information. So please, if you have seen any publicly available information or research that you think might be useful to us, then please send it over to this email address and put for my attention in the subject line, and it will find its way to me. So what are our next steps? So over the coming weeks, we will be analysing and bringing together all the information on the research that we have found so far. We can then start to identify any gaps in that research that we've collated, and then start considering where we can get this information from. So really, the more research we have, the better. So thank you in advance for anything that you might be able to send us. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you, Matthew. And just to sort of say thank you very much for that very, very detailed overview. Hopefully you at home have found it interesting, and you can see the scale of the challenge that we at the IFA are trying to undertake. And moving on to the next section, I'm going to sort of ask Stephen to sort of elaborate his view of the benefits and the why of this work. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you very much to both Matthew and to Caroline for all the hard work in this area. As a member of the MRSC, I've been watching this work stream with great interest and great enthusiasm. Even if it only tackled just one part of the problem that it's seeking to address, and that being to make data at the cause of death level more readily available to us in the profession in a consistent format, overcoming the multitude of challenges there are with ICD coding formats, and with getting consistency of groupings of causes of death over time. That in itself would have been a major achievement that would have enabled so much more day-to-day work by actuaries in terms of understanding mortality trends and patterns. But the ambition of the project is far wider than that, and to me, it gets to the heart of actually the comprehensibility and the reliability of the work we do in this area. And the reason I say that is when we actually take our projections, be they for best estimate or be stressed projections for risk management under solvency or under understanding the sensitivity of outcomes in a pension scheme and funding outcomes. When we take that work out to our users, we're often having to talk about fairly arcane language of particular parameters that we've used in a particular modeling framework. That means something to us, but ultimately, what does it mean to our users? And time again, I get, as it were, the lay user turning to me and saying, yeah, that's great, but what is it you're actually assuming? I'm acutely aware of my own health. I know I'm going to die of something. Tell me what you're assuming about the pattern for heart disease or the pattern for cancers. And of course, we don't have a single answer to that because our projections can be consistent with a multitude of different outcomes. But equally, when we can't provide some kind of confident answer around what our projections might be consistent with, some kind of real world narrative, it can often serve to slightly undermine the sort of credibility of what we're putting forward, despite the rigor which we've done in the background. And so to my mind, having this framework, this ability to marry up what's happening at the cause of death and a driver level with different projections that are produced in the standard parlance of the CMI model will be a fabulous step forward. Now, when I read the actual call for research that Caroline's taken us through, I was actually very much reminded of the seminal paper written by Richard Willits and a number of other members of the profession called Longevity in the 21st Century. And I find it quite staggering when I looked at when it was first published to realise it's now rapidly approaching its 20th anniversary. Now, that paper really carved out for the first time the landscape of what was happening in terms of drivers at that time and the sea change and what might be happening in terms of morbidity, mortality and longevity outcomes through various factors that were happening in the world around us. To my mind, this call of research coming out from the MRSC is very much to take that body of work from nearly 20 years ago and bring it up to date for so much that's happened in the world around us. So much that's happened in terms of medical advances, political changes, etc. And to bring together that body of current research across a multitude of disciplines and distill that for the benefit of all actuaries across the health, life and pensions sectors. So certainly I would encourage everyone with an interest in the mortality, the longevity, or indeed the morbidity areas to have a look at the call for research, to challenge the team. Do you agree with the catalysts identified? You may think of others. You may disagree with some being historical or current. So you may allocate them differently. And if you do have differing view, please do share sort of the reasoning for that, the evidence base you've got behind it. But more fundamentally, if you're aware of material that can help the team in terms of understanding what has been happening in terms of data on trends in drivers or the impact of particular drivers through to mortality rates, then the team would love to hear that. When Richard Willits and the other volunteers wrote Longevity in the 21st Century, they ended up citing at that time over 125 different publications. Now, I would expect that number to have grown considerably since, with so much that has happened, hence the reason why Caroline has got such a team around her to help distill that work. So if you do have knowledge of a publication you think might be insightful, please do share it on it. We don't mind if we get repeated copies. But above all, I think the really exciting thing for me is that actually once we have that body, that library of evidence, we'll start to understand the various different drivers, the various different touch points, and begin to form a common parlance with which we can refer to cause of death groupings and what we might be, why we might have differing views as professionals around the future for longevity in terms of some fundamentals, in terms of some drivers. So for me, I think it's going to be an exciting couple of years, and I really wish Caroline and the team all the best with it. But Sasha, I think we perhaps had a few specific questions that we might like to throw out to the team.
Yes, thank you, Stephen, and thank you for that excellent summary. You've really articulated well there the value and benefit of this piece of work. So if I can bring Caroline and Matthew back in. My role here is relatively easy. I get to sort of act as the glue, but I've got a few questions, so we'll see who wants to take them. I suppose this one probably goes to Matthew. Firstly, is sort of what is the relationship between the team and this development, and what the CMI does, and the Mortality Projections Committee in particular. How do they relate to each other?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a good question. So I guess I'm not going to probably have to sort of transgress my roles here and be a bit sort of trans rollist, which sounds quite trendy. So within the CMI, I guess within the MPC, the Mortality Projections Committee part of the CMI, which is the group which is involved with this, I guess we're sort of I think we are succeeding in remaining conceptually completely distinct. So for instance, nothing that has been done published by the CMI in the last year or will be published in the next year or whatever is in any way changed due to this, because that's all distinct. But on the other hand, the logistics are quite coordinated in I think a way which is positive for the MPC and for the MRSC and hence the profession as a whole. The point there being a lot of the work we've described, in particular around looking at the cause of death and about to start paying more and more with the ONS data. It involves a lot of people, and a lot of that manpower is coming from the MPC and within the CMI. Some of you may not be aware, but last year we started this initiative of a volunteer resource pool. So the CMI is obviously very volunteer led, but on top of the volunteers within the various different committees, we've created a group of volunteers not aligned with any particular committee to increase our flexibility within the CMI. So I think we've got at the moment 9 of those, if you like, floating volunteers, which obviously gives us great flexibility, and it's good for the volunteers because they get involved in a more flexible way than the committee structure normally allows. So I think we've got, I think it's 4 at the moment. It's been varying between 3 and 5 over the last year of those volunteers, if you like, attached to the MPC, helping with that work with Steve Bale and Cobus particularly involved on the, if you like, the normal committee side. So there's a very great logistical coordination, but conceptually keeping things very distinct, if that answers the question.
Thank you. Caroline, this is a question for you. I mean, so you're asking people to sort of volunteer their awareness of research. What level of person are you expecting to sort of contribute the research we're looking for?
So I would say absolutely anybody who is aware of any research at all, then just send it over. There really is just kind of like no levels. I mean, like I could be looking at somebody who's just out of university and their first actuarial job, and this is something which in the area they found interesting. So they've read something in the Times, and that led off to them doing more and more. And then yes, send it in, or kind of like. Or even you, Sasha, if you can find anything, then please do send it over. So really, and even when it comes, I mean, as I say, we want a bigger bank of research as possible, and that will be contradicting research as well. And that's good, because I think too often we sometimes end up with a bit of bias. So I think if we can get as much contradicting research as well, that would be great.
Caroline.
Sorry, go, Stephen.
No, I was just saying, Caroline, I just wondered as well, would you be enthusiastic for members to maybe tap up their friends and family, as it were, say if they happen to know a cardiologist or dementia expert or diabetes expert, say, what are the key papers in your field, what should we know about?
Yeah, absolutely. Great idea. Yeah. Just it's just a case of getting the word out there. I think we haven't had much response yet, because I just don't think we've got the word out enough. So I think if everybody, let's do a bit of an exponential increase here, and if everybody tells everybody 4 people, then the whole country will have it in no time.
So in the message there to anyone,
it's don't sort of pyramids telling us that.
Yes. So don't be nervous. If you think it's relevant, you said it. Don't assume someone else will know about it. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is, I'm not sure who wants to take this one, and I'm not going to pick on it, so I'll let someone respond to it. Is, sort of how has COVID-19 affected the challenge and the importance of this work? Who wants to?
I'll jump in first then. I think that this is probably doubled the amount of research that we need. To be honest, in my opinion, we have faced so much uncertainty now, and actually, to be honest, I think it really also. This isn't going to be something we're just doing for the next month. I think because we're going to be doing this for years, we are not going to know for a good number of years what the overall impact of COVID-19 is. We don't know what is the impact going to be on cancer diagnosis rates. What is the impact of long COVID? What is the social impacts that we might see? What is the impacts of the vaccine, the speed in which vaccines have been developed? So much uncertainty. So I think it's just kind of like doubled the need and the amount of research that we probably will be looking for.
Stephen,
I agree with agreeing with Caroline on that, and I think it very much makes it clear that everyone needs a more sort of concrete and clear and if you like segmented sort of driver-based approach to actually think through what's the rationale for their long-term rate or their sort of blending or both. And if you want to think through what's the impact of COVID-19 on the long term, then to do so you need to think through what are the drivers and what's changed, and you can't really have that without some form of driver-based or causal methodology. So it makes the case for this type of approach, I think, far more important, and hopefully makes therefore our contribution and or Caroline's work more important. Quite apart from all the short-term variabilities of COVID mortality.
Stephen, anything you sort of add to what Caroline and Matthew have just said?
I think I would echo it, but I'd also say that for those who look at the Universal Catalyst paper, it's a really good read, and actually it's a very thought-provoking read, and one of the sections in there is very specifically identifies COVID as its own sort of section in its own right, because it transcends all these different areas around how will the political environment change, how will the social trends change, what it might stimulate in terms of medical interventions, but equally what might it consequences might it have through long COVID and delays to treatments. And so in many ways, I suspect it accords very nicely. I suspect the sort of mental conundrum that most of us are going through at the moment of, well, how do we rationalize that kind of pre-COVID view in terms of some kind of narrative? And then how does that narrative change with COVID? And as it were, the pre-COVID narrative, at least for the short to medium term, may have been slightly easier to pin your hat on, because you could point at advances in well-documented research, whereas COVID is going to be very much the emerging thing, which each week and each month we'll get a whole new body of evidence that might sway how you might adjust the projections as a consequence.
Excellent. And just when we thought longevity was getting a little bit easier,
keep us in jobs for years.
Yeah, that's the way forward. That's the way forward. So if anyone's a junior member out there, please get involved. This is one of the most interesting areas you can go in. Okay, one more question. I'd like to ask about the international and younger ages. We typically think, at least in terms of the work we're talking about, in terms of the UK and the older ages. But does this have applications potentially for the international community in the younger ages? Who wants to pick that one up?
Can I kick off with the thoughts about the international bit, and then maybe Caroline could finish off. But I think with the international perspective, I think we tend to be a bit guilty of falling into a comfort zone of looking at the UK, or in fact very often just England and Wales, due to the natural situation of where we actually work and where our liabilities are if we're involved with insurance, or and also where the relevant data comes from. But clearly, I think one of the key things of what we're doing is the actual methodology and the principles we're developing. And in fact, I remember when we were thinking about the success criteria this time a year ago, one of the things I think we were going to have on the list, but didn't in the end, was the applicability to sort of international other countries. So we sort of very much think that the methodology should be applicable pretty much everywhere. Clearly, a lot of the details would be differing, whether it's the actual the way the cause of death might work in different countries. But again, international classification of disease, the ICD is international, so hopefully that could still be applicable across countries. The scenarios will clearly be different if one of the key scenarios is going to be around, for instance, health expenditure or smoking or whatever they might be. Then those are clearly going to be differing, but again, the principles still stand. So we're hoping, although it's got a very much a UK focus at the moment in terms of the calibration and also the default thinking behind it, everything. Maybe it's a bit too much of a promise, but very much a large portion of it should be internationally applicable. So having probably spoken too much about that, perhaps Caroline could talk about the age range aspect.
Yes, so on the age range aspect, I mean, yes, typically we do often concentrate on the age range, probably around about 50 to 80, because if you go much younger than that, you don't have many deaths, therefore you have a lot more uncertainty. And if you go higher than that, you have the issue of comorbidities, and it's not necessarily clear what the cause of death is. Having said that, I think when it comes to the research, yet again, more is best. So I think really what we would be looking for research over a wide range of ages, so we can at least have it in our bank and disseminate it, and then decide if it is relevant or not. I think we'd much rather have that research to our fingertips.
Okay, so hopefully that's been interesting. Hopefully giving you an insight of one of the most important topics that the MRC in particular is looking at. Hopefully it's given you a first to sort of get out there and find that research and send it in. But if you'd like to get more involved in this particular work stream or one of the other research priorities that the MRC is running at the moment, please get in touch via the Longevity and Mortality Member Interest Group, which can be found via LinkedIn. So get in touch via that group. Your help will be gratefully appreciated. In terms of where to find this research, the call for research paper, the Longevity Catalyst Universe, can be found in the research hub of the IFOA website. And if you've got any questions, comments, or anything you want to you can get in touch via research@actuaries.org.uk. Just make sure the subject is appropriate, otherwise it could end up in some kind of GI Actuaries inbox. They won't have a clue what we're talking about. So all that probably remains for me to say is I'd like to thank our guests for their contributions. Thank you very much for making the time and sharing your insights and your answers and what's going on in that area. And lastly, to thank you for dialing in and watching this. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll hopefully see you again soon for another Mortality and Longevity Member Interest Group webinar. Take care.
Great. Thank you. Bye.